Okay, everybody, welcome into our Bills and Vikings preview show here on cover1.net and Cover One Buffalo. Me, Nate Geary, and my co-host for the day, Matthew Coller, who reigns from Minnesota, but is a Buffalo guy, of course. And I guess I'm no longer the sound monkey in this situation. Although I guess I still could be, because at one time, if you didn't know, those that are watching or listening, I was Matthew's intern way back in like 2013 or 14 when you were still a young man.
Yeah, and you know what? You did a good job cutting all the sound. I don't know if I ever complimented you or ever mentioned that you did a halfway decent job. I was trying to keep you humble. Like, you know, if somebody does a really good sound bite, they get full of themselves. You just can't deal with that. So I just encouraged you to continue to cut sound. And I thought if you did that, then you would get places. And clearly I was wrong, but at least I had the clips that I wanted.
That's correct. And, you know, the crazy part is once you left, the whiner line really died down at GR. And I wonder if that has anything to do with you leaving.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe the whiner liners now have too many similarly dumb opinions that are going over the air from you. Maybe that's what's going on.
That's true. Maybe I'm doing the whining for them. Little did they know. And for you folks tuning in, if you aren't a premium subscriber to Cover One, Eric is doing you guys a solid and giving you 2 weeks to try it out. And if you don't know Eric's stuff, obviously you're missing out. He's over at The Athletic here in Buffalo too, doing a lot of great stuff with breakdowns and things for the Bills. So make sure you check that out at cover1.net. All right, Matt, let's dive into this because a 16.5-point underdog the Bills are. I can't even really remember a professional football game with that. Even like the 0-16 Browns were getting more respect from Vegas. I think, though, it's probably a pretty fair line to start, especially early in the week now.
Yeah, no, I think I'm taking the over. I mean, there is to say that there's a disparity in talent would be an extreme understatement, because at every position, aside from offensive line, there are Pro Bowl caliber talents on this Minnesota Vikings roster, and they just got stronger on the defensive side by adding Tom Johnson, who the Seattle Seahawks bizarrely cut, but he was a guy that played 68% of the snaps on the number one defense in the NFL last year, and now they get to bring him in as a rotational player. So when you go from spot to spot, this is a mature roster with stars all over the place that they have developed over 5 years with Mike Zimmer. This is basically the culmination of his vision when he got here in 2014. And Tom Johnson even commented today that, you know, at one time they were a young team and just hoping to get to this point, and here they are as a legitimate Super Bowl contender. And if you consider they were at the 35-yard line or lining up a 35-yard kick to be 2-0 and beating San Francisco and Green Bay, and that kind of tells you where this team is at, the way they were able to come back against Aaron Rodgers. And when you compare that to a team that is getting blown out in games and has no wide receivers whatsoever, no offensive line, I mean, it's just very hard to see them hanging with the Vikings, especially at US Bank Stadium, where even good quarterbacks have a lot of trouble. I've witnessed Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees having trouble moving the ball at US Bank Stadium. You consider what Josh Allen is up against, it's very hard to see him hanging with the Vikings.
Yeah, and one of our other subscribers, too, are guys that contribute on the podcast, Aaron Quinn. We've been sort of talking about all week, like, we really wanted Kirk Cousins. And he's such a polarizing, and I guess this is probably the best way to start this podcast is talking about one of the more polarizing for sort of really weird reasons, Matthew. He's not a guy that gets headlines off the field. He's not a Jake Cutler type that gets a bad rap for bad body language or throwing a ton of picks. He's really just sort of been a steady, consummate pro from the time that he basically overtook what was at the time the franchise and Robert Griffin. They quickly moved on to him, turned their attention to Kirk Cousins, and I think maybe unfairly kept pushing off his contract until they decided, well, you know, Alex Smith in the sort of back end of his career is going to be better here for the long term than Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins, to me, is maybe one of the more puzzling players in terms of evaluations, because truthfully, I mean, he is a difficult guy to fully evaluate and say, wow, this guy's a top 5 quarterback, because you do see mistakes, especially on film. But I could tell you, I mean, and I'm sure you can say this as well, he probably has yet at this point in his career up until this year played with this sort of legitimate wide receiver, tight end, run game. Now, the offensive line's a little shaky. We'll get into that. But in terms of the talent around him, Kirk Cousins has just got an embarrassment of riches. So what you've seen out of him in 2 games, this passing attack, so much more dynamic than it was with Case Keenum or even at times, going back a few years with Teddy Bridgewater. I mean, talk a little bit about what Kirk Cousins brings to this offense and sort of, are we at the ground level of what could be a top 4, top 5 passing offense?
So let me kind of take you back a little bit to 2016 with Kirk Cousins, where he had a lot of weapons and a really good offense. And I think when they tried to project what he would be in Minnesota with Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, Kyle Rudolph, is very similar to that when he had Deshaun Jackson, who's still balling now and helping out Ryan Fitzpatrick, Pierre Garçon, a criminally underrated wide receiver. Jordan Reed was healthy that year. Trent Williams is a top 5 left tackle when he's healthy. And when he had all those weapons together, he had his best year. And that was one of those seasons where Pro Football Focus puts him in the top 10, and his numbers are the best that they've ever been. And everything kind of aligns to say, yeah, this guy was really good. But I think that what you saw there when some of that supporting cast deteriorated is some of his shortcomings come out a lot more. So this is not a quarterback who goes off script brilliantly like a Carson Wentz or a Cam Newton can do, or you see this from Aaron Rodgers all day long, goes off script, holds the ball and finds guys downfield and things like that. You don't see that type of pocket presence from him that you would see from some of those great quarterbacks. But you also do see sometimes some unnecessary risk-taking. He's a guy that will hang in the pocket for a little too long or make a throw in situational football kind of things that you really wouldn't want to see. I mean, in week 1, he makes an ill-advised throw that almost is a pick 6, but it gets dropped. And then in week 2, he throws an interception, but it's brought back by the most ridiculous penalty call I've ever seen that goes against Clay Matthews. And we all forget about that, but even he acknowledged that was not what he was supposed to do on that play. That was not where he was supposed to put the ball. And it was probably when he threw that pick that didn't count, it was probably not the right time to do it either, considering it was a minute plus left. He had time to drive down the field, which he ultimately did. But you see some of the sort of pluses and minuses. He will take too many risks at times when he doesn't need to. He'll hang in the pocket too long. And there are times where he can be inaccurate. We're comparing him to the best quarterbacks in the league. Like, is he a really good starting quarterback? Absolutely. But is he Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady? No. Right. And when you see that a guy gets paid $84 million, you think, well, he better be the best quarterback in the league. But I think that he goes in that same sort of category of second-tier type quarterbacks that when given all those weapons, they can be successful. They can win the Super Bowl. We saw Joe Flacco get hot and win the Super Bowl. We saw Eli Manning get hot and win the Super Bowl. I think that it's usually the elite quarterbacks, but when everything is right around you, he is good enough. I don't know that Case Keenum was good enough. And part of it is that this week we saw Kirk Cousins come back from down 20-7 to Aaron Rodgers. You never would have seen that with Keenum. Keenum is not the type that you could get down a couple scores and he's going to throw you back into the game. That was the difference between the two and ultimately why they made the decision to move to Kirk Cousins.
Now, I'm glad you kind of talked about like the streakiness or sort of the quarterback that could get to the Super Bowl being getting hot and using Flacco as an example. Like I watched all the throws last week from Kirk Cousins, and he just sort of reminds me of a guy that when he does get hot, he's very difficult to sort of push off of that line or to sort of get off of his mark. And, a lot like I think the next thing about Cousins that intrigues me is sort of he does have the ability to move. Like he's not just a statue in the pocket like a Flacco. And I think when he moves and he sort of gets outside the pocket and he gets outside of the scope of the offense, he is, a pretty dangerous player in his own right. But what I saw, at least in the 30-some throws I think he made last week, was that accuracy, and especially the one that Thielen touchdown at the end of the game and just sticks out to me big time. It wasn't the kind of throw that wows you in terms of, putting like the Elam throw from the Carolina game in the preseason where he's threading it between defenders, but it was a perfectly timed pass in between two Green Bay defenders. Like, talk a little bit about Cousins in terms of when he's on, how difficult he is to sort of get off of that, especially in the realm and in the flow of a football game.
Yeah, and that's interesting because in the first half, he was able to move the ball, but he wasn't able to finish too many drives.
Right.
And so at the end of the first half, it was classic Kirk Cousins where they had 7 points on the board, but he had great stats, so it was like, well, this is typical. They're losing the game, but he's 21 for 28 or something really good that's going to help his quarterback rating. But then in the second half, especially, I think the difference maker with him, and this is where, maybe they should have invested more in the offensive line. The difference maker for him is always the protection that he gets. And when you look at his career, every quarterback is going to go down in their quarterback rating when they're pressured. That's natural. His goes way down. I mean, his basically cuts in half. But what you see when he's kept clean is he's very, very good. And he puts himself among that top category when he has time to sit back there, go through his progressions, pick apart defenses. And that's where I think it helped him get hot in the second half of that game. The other thing, too, is that this is a guy who's always had great play callers. I mean, he has really fallen into some excellent play callers, from Kyle Shanahan to Jay Gruden, I think, is very good. And now we're already seeing that John DeFilippo is there, too. And you mentioned the accuracy. He's a guy that I think is just getting stronger with that as he goes along in his career. That, I wrote a piece about how he worked with a quarterback guru, and a lot of guys do, but it seemed to really help him in terms of driving the ball down the field and into tight windows. Now, I would say that Cousins criticized himself for that Thielen throw, saying that, maybe it was a little too close for comfort when it came to the safety. And that has been a criticism of him too. But, I think what you find is that there are criticisms of him to be had, and they're all fair. And sometimes he will just wing a ball out there, and we haven't seen it yet, but he has been playing with fire when it comes to strip sacks and fumbles and his pocket presence and seeing the rush, things like that. He led the league over the last 3 years in fumbles. And so there are these deficiencies there with him, but at the same time, those throws are ones that Keenum could not make. And they're ones you need if you're going to beat Aaron Rodgers in a playoff game, because everything else has been laid out for you. You have a receiver, 2 receivers who are going to bail you out, 2 receivers who are going to make great catches, a running back that I'm certain will get going here soon and can play receiver when you ever want him to, Dalvin Cook. I mean, so many versatile pieces moving. And what we also see is the Packers went 1 for 5 in the red zone in that game. And this Vikings defense was not perfect. But when you can stop Rodgers 4 out of 5 times in the red zone from scoring touchdowns, I mean, that's an advantage that Kirk Cousins never had when he was in D.C.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Well, let's move maybe away from his weapons and more so to that offensive line, which I think, probably is argued maybe be their weakest link of the team in terms of up front. Riley Reif probably, and I mean, you could speak to this better than I can. He's just sort of a name that stood out to me as probably the top guy. And it's not a bad position to have at that left tackle either. But talk a little bit about the offensive line and keeping Kirk Cousins upright, which you mentioned is a very important part of his success.
I think that the offensive line, until they get Pat Elflein back, their center, which may be this week. He practiced today. It may not be. It might be next week when they go up against the Rams on Thursday Night Football. But without him in there, it's very much holding on for dear life. When they were going up against Mike Daniels and Kenny Clark and Muhammad Wilkerson, those great front 3 from the Green Bay Packers, you could see how much it affected them early in the game, especially since they couldn't run the ball. And a lot of Kirk Cousins' success in his career comes off of executing play action. And so when you're not running the ball very well, it's harder to execute the play action. And I think it was kind of a domino effect in that first half and a bit in the second half against San Francisco, where he went 0 for 7 in the fourth quarter. So I think that it has affected him, and it has affected their offense, especially in the running game and the passing game. It hasn't been too bad, but also they haven't gone up against a lot of great edge rushers yet. I mean, I think those kind of come later in the schedule when they go up against New Orleans, when they go up against the Eagles. So far it's been the interior line, and they've been beat up, but it really hasn't affected Cousins too much. When they get Elflein back, it's a totally different look. He's great in the screen game. He is exceptional in the run game, one of the smartest players on the field at any time, the leader of that offensive line. I mean, I think of him as a guy the Vikings have had a ton of really good centers throughout their history. Mick Tingelhoff back in the day, and John Sullivan was good, and Matt Burke was good. I look at him like he's going to be in that category. And for Bills fans, they remember how important Kent Hall was and how important Eric Wood was.
Right.
You know,
more than ever now, right?
Yeah. I think of Pat Elflein as being in that same sort of category. So him being out has been really big for them. I think they could patchwork the left guard position. Their left guard, Nick Easton's out for the year, but you could kind of put a guy in there and survive. What you mentioned about Riley Reif, last year he was hurt the second half of the year and played through it and struggled. So when you look at his PFF grades, you're not going to see as good as maybe in the past. So far, he's looked really good, and that is huge for them protecting Kirk Cousins.
No doubt about it. All right, let's talk about especially the backfield, because I think Dalvin Cook, he's on the injury report this week, correct?
Yeah, he didn't practice today, and I'm interested to see what happens there because he went down late in the game, and we didn't get any sort of really detailed report on what went wrong. He talked today and said it was a day-by-day thing. So it looks like it's a hamstring, and it's tough to say whether he's going to be playing, but it does not seem serious, if I could put it that way. They usually don't run a guy out to talk if they've got a serious injury, so I would expect right at this moment that he's playing.
And the other guy, too, Latavius Murray, who I thought it filled in really well, especially if you're a fantasy owner last year like me, you picked him up sort of midseason. Really towards the end of the year, was a 100-yard back, was a bell cow, especially in the red zone. That red zone threat of his continues, obviously, as Dalvin Cook becomes pretty much the premier back. But you have a guy like Murray who can provide you, those supplemental carries when a guy like Dalvin Cook, especially a guy coming off an ACL injury, a very serious one at that. So talk a little bit about Murray and how he sort of comes in and can really sort of be the back that every team in the NFL is looking for, like that guy that could come off the bench and can really – like sort of like a pitcher, like a relief pitcher, kind of come in and not need to warm up for 2 innings. He can come in and be the guy right away.
Yeah, I mean, how many teams would say that they have a recent Pro Bowler as their backup running back? I mean, it wasn't too long ago, 2015, that Latavius Murray was a Pro Bowler with Oakland and then played a key role out of a rotation over the last 2 years, and he's the backup to Dalvin Cook. I think first that tells you how talented Dalvin Cook is. That he has the potential to be one of the best running backs in the NFL. But I would also say for Murray that he is a big-time parachute for them in case anything goes wrong. I mean, if Dalvin Cook is out this week, you don't feel like you're falling way off in the number of things that you can do, that he is kind of a change of pace now. He's much more of a downhill type of runner, although Dalvin Cook can run anyway. It's amazing. I mean, he can run power, he can run zone, he's got great vision, he breaks tackles, there isn't anything that he can't do, but to have Murray, even if he is more one-dimensional, still be explosive, hard to bring down because of his size. And the one thing that goes overlooked with him is that he might be the best pass-blocking running back in the NFL. And for a team that's having some struggles up front with protection, that's not certain about its offensive line, to have a guy that could come in on third down, and you can even line up Dalvin Cook at wide receiver and have Latavius Murray in the backfield if you want to. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more of that. It's a valuable asset. It's not the most sexy or entertaining thing to talk about, but when they look at what value he brings, he is one of the most intelligent players I've been around, and you could see why he is a very, very smart pass blocker. And I think the other thing, too, that you could sneak him out of the backfield. Like he doesn't have a ton of numbers when it comes to catching the ball, but he's not like a guy that's going to drop everything that's thrown his way. And they did that a little bit toward the end of last year. So he is definitely one of those valuable depth players that they have that makes this offense even more dangerous.
Yes, I mean, obviously, when you're talking about pass catchers now, I think we can kind of put them all in a group because Rudolph is one of the more athletic tight ends in the league in terms of he's got the size. He does have sort of that sneaky speed. Not that really tight ends, you ever get to fully see the speed of a tight end. They're not really the kind of guys that are running go routes. But I think this group of pass catchers is pound for pound, especially in an NFC where in New Orleans, obviously, Michael Thomas, who's just having an unbelievable start to his season and really his career. But I look at Thielen, Diggs, and even to a certain extent now Treadwell, who had been the kind of receiver that I think you're going to start to see more and more in this league that take 2 or 3 years to fully develop into what you've seen from a guy in college now into the pros. It does take longer for receivers. And I hope that in the case of like that you're going to have a similar developmental path as a guy like Treadwell, where in year 3, he finally starts to get it in terms of the nuances of route running and where he fully fits in the offense. And it looks like anyways for Treadwell, that might be the slot. But these pass catchers as a whole, Matthew, I mean, obviously Stephon Diggs sticks out to me, but so does Thielen. Like I sort of, it was a couple of people in the chat talking about when we talk about the wide receivers and defense, like this is the time to sort of get in the fetal position.
Oh, it most definitely is, because the best defenses in the league can't cover Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. Let me touch on Treadwell first before I tell you about those guys. Treadwell has gotten off to a really rough start in these first 2 weeks. I mean, he's got 4 drops in 2 weeks, including one that turned into an interception. There have been routes that he's gotten wrong, and it really feels like we are getting to the point with him where it's make or break, where they are not yet going to cut him or trade him, but at the same time, if you do not see him perform going forward here really soon, then Aldrick Robinson, the guy they just picked up, he'll be in, or they're going to use more 2 tight end or whatever it might be. He's going to have to pick it up, or he's just not going to be with this organization anymore or make any sort of impact. Now, with Diggs and Thielen, what's interesting about those 2 guys is that neither one of them is big. I mean, Thielen is maybe 6'1", might go 6'2", but he's not like 6'4", 6'5", or anything like that. So neither one is huge. Neither one is the fastest guy ever. Both fast, but not 4.2 guys. What they are is they are technicians. They are 2 of the best route runners you are ever going to find, and they understand the game about as well as any wide receivers in the NFL. Both of them also have incredible hands. And what's unique about them is you could put them anywhere in the formation and you can run them anywhere and they'll have success. You could send them deep. You could send them short over the middle. You can ask them to break tackles and get yards after catch. I've seen them do that. They have just an incredible knowledge of the game, and they work exceptionally hard and push each other. They're actually both close to each other. So, I mean, they work together to continually improve, and they've gone on this path together. So it's a really interesting story, because most of the time you have like your number 1 guy and he gets 100 catches, and then it's kind of everybody else, even if they're good. In this case, it's one of those rare situations. I can only think of a few when Keenan McCardle and Jimmy Smith played together, that those 2 guys were kind of a 1 and 1A. And it's exactly like this. And with Case Keenum last year, with Kirk Cousins this year, I think you're already seeing how valuable those guys are, especially since with either one, it doesn't have to be the most accurate throw. That in both weeks, you've seen them make spectacular catches on throws that weren't perfect.
Now, let's move over to the defense, Matthew, because I think that's going to really – it's kind of hard to really know in terms of the Bills' point of view which is going to ask. I mean, in terms of statistics through 2 games, obviously there's not a huge sample size to get a full idea of where this team's going to rank by the end of the year. It's sort of middle of the pack in terms of the Vikings run pass, sort of right around 14 to 16 area. And then offensively, when we were just talking about, they're right now a top 5 unit, especially on through the air. But I look at this interior defensive line, and I think that you could just sort of get caught up in how deep the cornerback position is, or just the defensive back position in general is. And then you look at the linebacker position with Kendricks and Barr. I just think that a guy like Sheldon Richardson flew under the radar in terms of a signing and a guy that they brought in. And listen, I mean, especially Bills fans are very familiar with Richardson and Muhammad, both guys that they're going to be playing the next 2 weeks in the interior of the defensive line, coming from the Jets, obviously. So they're very familiar with those names. But a guy like Richardson never really had quite the depth around him, with Linval Joseph, another huge man in the middle of this defense. And then obviously Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter, who's another name that I think maybe a lot of Bills fans aren't quite familiar with, but they probably will get familiar with this Sunday.
I mean, just starting with Sheldon Richardson, there's a good case to be made that he has been the best Minnesota Viking through the first 2 weeks. Not even just on the defensive side, but the best player that they've had. He has been dominant. I mean, I want to say that he had 9 pressures last week and 7 in week 1. I mean, he was blowing up guards against the 49ers and ruined their game. On the last play, that's an interception to Harrison Smith, he's the one that's right there in the face of Jimmy Garoppolo. And I think what you look at more now that we kind of understand how to analyze football a little better with numbers is that the pressures are the number you really want to look at. Like sacks are great, but they kind of go up and down with certain guys. But Sheldon Richardson only had 1 sack last year, but was still one of the better defensive tackles at the 3 technique spot at his pressures per rush. And so the Vikings looked at that and they said, yeah, we need to get this guy playing next to Linval Joseph, who you mentioned is a premier nose tackle in the NFL and can do it all. And on the edges, I mean, it's just dangerous for any team that comes in here. Everson Griffin is a do-it-all type guy who has an incredible toolbox of pass rush moves and a motor that never quits for the entire game. And Danielle Hunter is a guy who signed a $70 million contract and I think is getting better because he was drafted so young as a project and has really seen his entire skill set come to fruition in what he can do. So even in preseason training camp, what we were seeing was a guy that looked like he was ready to take another step. And in the first 2 weeks, it certainly looks that way. And if you're throwing out anything less than a top-notch right tackle, you're going to have a long day against Danielle Hunter because he is one of the all-time best athletes ever in the combine at his position. And then he's only gotten bigger and stronger since then. This is a guy who's 6'6", ran under a 4.6 40, and also scored extremely high on the bench press, jumping, everything else like that. And now he's put together the technique to go along with that freakishness. He reminds me a lot of someone like Julius Peppers.
Wow, yeah. And I can just kind of remember when that ticker came across that he got that $70 million contract. I'm like, who? And I think like after Sunday, I myself and especially with the right tackle position here in Buffalo, and quite honestly, Jordan Mills has been like the fourth least talked about guy because the inside has been such a nightmare for the Bills that we've sort of forgotten about at times how difficult and how poor Jordan Mills has played at times, especially in the 2 years prior. That's going to be a serious test for this Bills offensive line that has yet to find that continuity. I guess for me, the reason that I started with Richardson and Joseph is because the deficiencies in terms of communication, and this is going to happen anytime with a rookie quarterback. And I'm glad that Brian Dable talked about, I think there's a tendency to really blame the offensive line for screw-ups and especially communication screw-ups. But a lot of that goes on top of the quarterback. And with a rookie quarterback, you're going to have mistakes. And this is not the defense you want to be having communication errors in terms of sliding protections one way or the other, or telling your running back where he needs to be on the edge, because this is a unit. And maybe before we talk about the linebackers, I'd like to talk about the defensive backs, because I looked a little bit of what the Chargers did with their young safety. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I have to think that the Minnesota Vikings saw what they did with their rookie safety, thinking that, man, I think we should do the same thing with Harrison Smith, a guy who can be a box defender, can play the deep third, but can blitz as well. And I just have to think they watched the film and they're thinking that they're going to blitz the hell out of Harrison Smith this week.
So I go back to last year and just how rookie quarterbacks tend to perform against the Vikings. And Jared Goff led the #1 scoring offense in the NFL last year as a second-year quarterback. He came into Minnesota and scored 7 points. And that kind of tells you the story that he was being helped along significantly as a young quarterback by his coach, Sean McVay, who also worked with Kirk Cousins and is a brilliant dude, right? But Mike Zimmer used Harrison Smith to play games with Jared Goff that entire day, and Goff couldn't make the adjustments from his first reads. Harrison Smith will move up to the line just a second before it snapped. Harrison Smith will see things that other people do not see. He will do whatever he wants sometimes. Sometimes he'll see something and just go off script completely and do something that Mike Zimmer didn't even call, but he trusts Harrison Smith to do that. And he reminds me, just trying to make comparisons to paint the picture a little bit, of what Troy Polamalu meant to the Steelers defense, because you do that same thing. You mentioned being the box defender. Yeah, he's going to rush off the edge. He'll get sacks. He's going to drop deep sometimes. They use him for everything, and he has such incredible instincts for the game that I think he's the premier player at that position in the entire NFL. and made a case for himself last year as the defensive MVP. He was so good. I think he was the best player on the Vikings defense last year, and that's even with Everson Griffin having a really great dominant season. And for a quarterback, especially without a lot of experience, I think that's an impossible task to have to read where he's going to be on every play and then understand that that might change as soon as he snaps the ball.
So I'm interested now, sticking with the defensive backs, because I think we already know about Waynes and Rhodes. Like, talk about premier corners in this league. They could play man, they could play zone. And quite honestly, Rhodes isn't talked about enough as being a top 3 or 4 and maybe even higher corner in the league in terms of athleticism, just his ball skills are off the charts. The guy I'm really interested in hearing you talk about is Mike Hughes, the rookie corner that I think maybe fell right into their laps in this draft, this past draft, and a guy that has incredible athleticism, speed, playing the nickel corner position, right?
Well, that will be interesting to see, actually, this week, because he started week 1 at the nickel, Mike Hughes did, because Mackenzie Alexander, who was a 2016 second-round pick, because he was hurt. And then last week, they decided to start Alexander, but he got benched midway through the game for forgetting about Jimmy Graham on 2 different occasions. So Mike Zimmer was not happy about that at all, and Mike Hughes went back into the game. Alexander did come back in later, but I'm interested to see what happens there. Last year, they had Terrence Newman on his last legs playing that position, but he was brilliant. He was just fantastic at the nickel corner. At age 39, he moved over there and was as good as you ever could have hoped. And this time around, it's 2 guys that don't have a whole lot of experience. And Mike Hughes impressed the heck out of everybody in training camp preseason. He picked up on the defenses faster than they expected. He's a guy that when he turns, it's just extremely quick, which might be, maybe the most basic thing I could tell you, but it's really true. When you watch him and he's got to flip the hips, he could cover anybody one-on-one. So he is a high-end talent, but also one of the very few areas you could ever think about attacking. Like, where else are you going to go at with this team? I mean, you can't go at Xavier Rhodes. I mean, in week 1, he was targeted once, and it was for an interception. I mean, that's the type of things that he's able to do. So, maybe you can attack Waynes if you're a great quarterback, but Josh Allen certainly isn't that yet. So maybe that is a spot where they could try to take advantage a little bit in the run game. If you're inexperienced, the run fits might be a bit of a challenge. But, I mean, you still have top draft picks there, whoever's playing, Alexander or Hughes. I think they are kind of feeling their way through that for who's going to be the starter long term.
All right, man, let's talk the last position here up the middle of this defense. Yeah, kicker, right? Yeah, that's probably the one we should talk about. But Dan Bailey, I mean, the rich get richer, I guess, right? But for you guys, I look at the middle linebacker and the strong side linebacker position. Obviously, Kendricks is a guy that everyone I don't know which one's more recognizable at this point in their career. Anthony Barr, Eric Kendricks, I don't know. And Gideon's another guy in there too that probably doesn't get talked enough about because those 2 guys are just they're perennial players that are only sort of at the base level or ascending of their careers, especially a guy like Barr who's going to be up for a payday this offseason.
Yeah, he is. And in long term, that's going to be a really interesting situation. The fact that he did not sign a long-term contract like Stephon Diggs and Eric Kendricks did in the offseason, and Danielle Hunter, he's kind of the last man waiting, and maybe they end up franchise tagging him. I'm not sure. One of the things that Mike Zimmer loves about Anthony Barr is that you can ask him to do just about anything, and he's so familiar with the defense, and he's such a smart player that he's going to be able to do it. And not every linebacker is even close to that understanding of the game to be able to do a number of different things. I mean, he can drop back in the zone. He can blitz from any area. They can just run many different schemes with him that he could succeed in. And I think that's one of the reasons they like him. Now, the first 2 games, this is the one criticism you'd have against Barr, is that sometimes he will have a few games where he looks like an MVP and just dominates. And then there are other games where he's kind of just another guy out there. And I think for the first 2 games, there's been a little bit of that with him just kind of being another guy out there. Eric Kendricks has not gotten off to a great start to the season, but is one of the best cover linebackers. So if you think you're just going to throw swing passes all the time, he's going to make that a lot more difficult because he's so quick. He's such a great tackler. and he gets to the ball out of the backfield, running backs really fast. When he was drafted, it was, he's undersized. He's undersized. Well, I mean, first of all, people should have learned from London Fletcher and Sam Mills that undersized is not always the worst thing in a linebacker position. But Kendricks is so quick, though. It's like having a hybrid safety. He's so quick that he can cover a tight end that's fast if you need him to, running backs out of the backfield. So the combination here, and plus how good these guys know Mike Zimmer's defense since they've been in it, since they've been drafted, they're a really important and vital combination there. I do think with Ben Gideon, he's going to be just in on a run situation, but it's really got to be a run situation. I mean, it's got to be like 3 tight ends, 3rd and 2. I think what teams worked to do against him was try to get him into pass coverage where he's not all that great. And so just using their different personnel. And so I think that Zimmer has adjusted this year. We're going to see more 3 safety looks from him in certain like 50-50, could be a run, could be a pass, like a 3rd and 4 or 3rd and 5 type of situation, maybe instead of using Gideon.
Interesting. All right, man. Well, thanks a lot for hopping on with me tonight and spending some of your dinner time with me. I know the folks back here in Buffalo appreciate it. We, I don't want to say miss you, but, you know, I guess.
Don't you? Well, let me say this, Nate. You were the worst intern I ever had. So, no, I'm kidding. But when you're in my position and you have someone who is an intern, work their way up and get better and improve and get more opportunities, it's a point of pride. So I'm very glad to see all the things that you're doing, and I hope people enjoyed our conversation.
I as well. Thanks, Matt. And for all those for listening, thanks. We appreciate you tuning in. And remember, we are running a 2-week promotion where you can check out the premium content on cover1.net for free for 2 weeks. So if you've been on the fence, make sure you head over to cover1.net and check it out there. So for me, Nate Geary, Matthew Coller, we appreciate you stopping along tonight for Cover One Buffalo.